Hey, it's Kylie from PaintedWing. Today I'm going to be demonstrating how to paint a barn owl. For this painting, I'm going to be using 5 different colors: yellow ochre, burnt sienna, raw umber, Paynes Grey, and Prussian Blue. I am also painting this on 16 by 20 Arches cold press paper. I'm going to begin by applying blue paint using a number 12 brush. And then I'm going to blend it out. You can tell my brush was a little dirty, but that's okay. For this part of the head, I'm going to be adding some Paynes Grey. After creating a light wash, I'm going to sprinkle some salt on top, which will help add a nice texture to the paint. Now I'll be adding yellow ochre to the head. I'm just going to allow these 2 colors to mix. And a little extra gray here. A little extra salt here, and the piece does look a little strange right now, but just wait, it'll look pretty in a little bit. Now while that area dries, I'm going to move on to a different part of the barn owl. For this area, I am mixing the Prussian Blue with the Paynes Grey to get sort of a bluish gray color. Now I'm moving on to some feathers. One thing you'll notice while I paint is I like to move around the piece. This is to help make sure that I don't overwork any area, and I also allow the paint to dry. For this area, I'm using yellow ochre paint and also a slightly smaller brush. This is a number 4 right here. Here you'll notice me go back and forth between adding water and applying paint. For this process, I like to use 2 separate brushes. While this area is still damp, I'm going to be adding some raw umber paint. While this area is still damp, I'm going to be adding some little dots of Paynes Grey. Using a clean brush dipped in water, I'm going to go over this area just to soften it a little bit and blend things. Using a number 16 round brush, I'm going to add water to the center of the owl's back. Now I'm going to add different colors of paint to this area, starting with raw umber. Then I'm going to add a little bit of yellow ochre and then Paynes Grey. Now I'm going to clean off my brush and then dip it in clean water, and then I'm just going to splatter my brush onto the wash. This is to intentionally create watercolor blooms. Here I'm splattering the area with some blue paint, and then lastly I'm going to add some salt while the area is still wet. Here you can see the beautiful texture that formed once the paint dried. Using a number 0 brush, I'm going to add small round dots to the back of the head. Here I'm creating feathers using gestural brushstrokes. For this process, I'm using a wet brush on dry paper. I'm going to add some details to the feathers using a round brush dipped in Paynes Grey. For the next 2 feathers, I'm going to be creating a wash using Paynes Grey and yellow ochre. Because there's a shadow here, I'm going to add a little extra Paynes Grey, keeping it pretty saturated. While that area dries, I'm going to be moving on to the face of the barn owl. I'm going to be starting off with a light wash of Paynes Grey. I'm going to make the paint pretty diluted. For the area right around the eye, I'm going to be mixing in a little bit of raw umber and yellow ochre paint. Now I'm going to blend out the paint using a clean brush dipped in water. Now I'm going to be painting the small feathers surrounding the barn owl's face. Using a small brush with a pointed tip will make this process easier. Now I'm going to be adding multiple areas of brown paint around the eye. Now I'm going to add a few details using Paynes Grey. Now I'm going to add an extra layer of raw umber paint. With a small brush dipped in Paynes Grey paint, I'm going to draw the feathers on the face of the owl. To soften this area, I'm going to take a clean brush dipped in water and then brush it on top of where I just painted. For the owl's beak, I'm using a rose paint by Winsor & Newton. Here I'm adding a couple details on the feathers. For the eye, I'm going to begin by applying a light layer of raw umber paint and then allow it to dry. In order to create a shadow on the top of the eye, I'm going to go in with Paynes Grey paint. I'm also going to make sure I leave a spot for a highlight. Now I'm going to allow the paint to dry and we'll finish the eye in a little bit. In the meantime, I'm going to add details to the rest of the face. Now that the eye is dry, I'm going to go back in with a small brush using Paynes Grey paint. I'm going to keep the paint pretty saturated so it appears black. Lastly, I'm going to be adding a foot to the owl. For the foot, I'm going to be using a number 0 and a number 4 round brush dipped in Paynes Grey paint. For the foot, I won't be adding too much detail. After a couple last details, I am now finished with the painting. Thank you so much for joining me as I paint this barn owl. It is my goal to combine detailed watercolors with loose watercolors. And I am pretty happy with how it turned out. If you enjoyed this tutorial, consider subscribing or even supporting me on Patreon.